The auctioneer's gavel hovered in midair, poised to seal a $1 million bid, when a voice cut through the gilded silence like a blade through silk. $50 million! The words didn't echo, they detonated. Crystal chandeliers seemed to shudder. The scent of French lilies and old money turned suddenly suffocating. Every head in the private auction hall turned toward the source, and Ariel Thompson felt her bow freeze against the strings of her Stradivarius. She knew who had spoken before she even looked. Kang Minyi sat 3 rows back, perfectly still in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. The tailored fabric couldn't quite conceal the traditional Korean tattoos crawling up his neck, dragons and phoenixes that marked him as royalty in a world that existed beneath the law. Sharp cheekbones cast shadows across his face, eyes so dark they seemed to consume light rather than reflect it. He looked carved from obsidian, beautiful and lethal. The auctioneer stammered, I beg your pardon, Mr. Kang." "You heard me." Minyi's voice carried that dangerous quality, silk wrapped around steel, a trace of soul in his accent, softened by years building an empire in America. 50 million for a private performance, one night, just her and her violin. Ariel's fingers tightened around her instrument. She'd performed for presidents, for tech billionaires, for European aristocracy. She'd learned to keep her face composed, unflinching, no matter who sat in the audience. But this man wasn't asking to sit in an audience. Around the room, reactions rippled like shockwaves. The elderly oil heiress in the front row clutched her pearls. A Dubai prince frowned, calculating whether to counter. But most telling were the reactions from the handful of Korean guests scattered throughout the hall, the way they suddenly found their champagne fascinating, the way they shifted in their seats, the way they avoided looking directly at Kang Minyi. Because they knew, everyone in certain circles knew. Kang Minyi was the man who had never been photographed with a woman, who had built the West Coast's most feared Korean syndicate without ever showing weakness, without ever caring about anything beyond power and control. Men bowed when he entered rooms, rivals disappeared when they crossed him. He was organized crime given human form. And he had just bid the GDP of a small nation to sit next to a violinist for one night. But before we find out why the most dangerous man on the West Coast just spent $50 million on a woman he's never met, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tailies, and drop a comment below telling me if you'd accept this invitation. Trust me, you're going to want to see where this goes. Now back to the auction. The auctioneer looked to Ariel, desperation in his eyes. She was the talent after all, she had to agree. Ariel's pulse thundered in her ears, but her face remained a mask of professional composure. She'd spent 6 years perfecting that mask, ever since the night her world had shattered in a hail of gunfire meant for someone else, ever since she'd learned that showing fear was the same as showing blood to sharks. "The performance was advertised as public," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest, "for the Children's Hospital Foundation." Minyi's gaze locked onto hers, and Ariel felt the impact like a physical blow. There was something in those obsidian eyes, not desire, not romance, but something far more unsettling, recognition, as if he could see straight through her carefully constructed walls to the shattered glass beneath. "The money still goes to the hospital," he said, "but I don't share well with others. One night, Miss Thompson, you play whatever you choose, I sit and listen, that's all I'm asking." That's all he was asking, as if $50 million was pocket change, as if commandeering a world-renowned musician for a private concert was a reasonable request. One of Minyi's bodyguards shifted behind him, hand resting casually near his jacket in that telltale way that suggested a weapon. The man's earpiece was visible, his posture military precise. These weren't security guards hired for the evening. These were soldiers. Ariel noticed something else. The other guests were creating distance, an invisible radius around Kang Minyi expanding as people suddenly remembered they needed to refresh their drinks, check their phones, admire the artwork on the far wall. Even the staff seemed to move with extra caution near him, like prey animals sensing a predator. She should say no. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse this man who wore danger like cologne, who made the temperature in the room drop just by speaking. But $50 million could fund the children's hospital wing for 5 years, and there was something in the way he'd said her name, Miss Thompson, that suggested he already knew far more about her than he should. "One night," she repeated slowly, buying time to think, "just you and the music." "Just me and the music," Minyi confirmed. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, in a location of my choosing, for your safety. For her safety, from what, from whom? Ariel looked at this man, this beautiful, terrifying stranger who radiated power and darkness, and felt the weight of a decision that would change everything. She was shattered glass trying to pass as a whole person. He was a monster dressed in a $10,000 suit. What could possibly go wrong? Going once, the auctioneer ventured weakly. Minyi's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those bottomless eyes. Something that looked almost like desperation, though that seemed impossible for a man who controlled empires. Going twice. Ariel lifted her chin, meeting that lethal gaze with her own carefully controlled one. She'd survived worse than one night with a Mafia boss. She'd survived the unsurvivable. Sold, she said before the auctioneer could finish. $50 million for one private performance. The room erupted in whispers, but Ariel heard none of it. Because Kang Minyi was standing now, buttoning his suit jacket with precise movements, and walking toward her with the controlled grace of a predator who just claimed his prey. As he approached, she noticed the tattoos more clearly, traditional Korean imagery that told stories in ink, dragons breathing fire up the side of his neck, phoenix wings spreading beneath his collar, symbols of power, of rebirth, of things that rose from ashes. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and dark, cedar and smoke. Close enough to see that his eyes weren't entirely black after all, but the deepest brown she'd ever seen, like looking into an abyss. Tomorrow night, he said quietly, voice low enough that only she could hear. My men will collect you at 8. Bring only your violin and yourself. Where are we going? Ariel asked, hatting how her voice almost wavered. For the first time, something like emotion crossed Minyi's face, a ghost of pain quickly buried. Somewhere I haven't been able to enter for 3 years, he said. Somewhere that needs music again. Then he did something that shocked her more than the $50 million bid. He bowed, a formal, respectful Korean bow that seemed completely at odds with everything else about him. When he straightened, that mask of controlled danger was back in place, but Ariel had seen beneath it for just a second, had seen the man inside the monster, and realized with creeping certainty that tomorrow night wasn't about a performance at all. It was about ghosts, his and hers, and the melody that haunted them both. The black Mercedes arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, because men like Kang Minyi didn't do approximations. Ariel watched from her apartment window as 2 bodyguards emerged, scanning the street with the practiced efficiency of military operatives before one nodded toward her building. She'd spent the day trying to convince herself this was just another performance. She'd played for dictators and drug lords masquerading as philanthropists. Music didn't discriminate, and neither did her bank account. But her hands had trembled while rosining her bow, and she'd changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple black dress, elegant, professional, unmemorable. The violin case felt heavier than usual as she descended the stairs. The bodyguard who opened the car door was the same one from the auction. Up close, she could see the scar tissue on his knuckles, the way his eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing threats. He didn't speak, just gestured for her to enter. The interior smelled of leather and that same dark cologne from yesterday. Minyi sat in the back, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The tattoos continued down his forearms, intricate knots and symbols she didn't recognize. He was reading something on a tablet, and didn't look up when she slid in beside him. The door closed with a definitive click. Locked. Miss Thompson, he finally acknowledged her, setting the tablet aside. In the dim light of the car, his features were all sharp angles and shadows. Thank you for being punctual. You paid $50 million, Ariel replied, forcing her voice steady. The least I can do is be on time. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Most people would have run, or brought security of their own. Should I have? Probably, he studied her with unsettling intensity. But you're not most people, are you? Ariel Thompson, Juilliard graduate at 19, Carnegie Hall debut at 21, 3 international awards. Then you disappeared for 2 years, and when you came back you changed. The critics say your playing has more depth now. Maury Payne. Ariel's blood turned cold. You've done your research. I always do. Minyi's gaze didn't waver. What the research doesn't say is why you stopped performing Vivaldi. It was your signature before, now you won't touch it. Her fingers tightened on the violin case. because Vivaldi was playing that night, when the bullets came through the restaurant window, when her parents. Everyone has pieces of themselves they'd rather keep private, she said carefully. Yes, Minnie's voice softened almost imperceptibly. They do. The car glided through Seattle's streets, leaving the lights behind, heading toward the waterfront, toward the industrial district where legitimate businesses didn't operate after dark. Where are we going? Ariel asked again. Minnie turned to look out the window, and for a moment his reflection in the glass looked almost vulnerable. To face the only thing that still frightens me, he said quietly, silence. The opera house rose from the waterfront like a Gothic cathedral, all arched windows and carved stone that spoke of old Seattle money, but the windows were dark, boarded over. Graffiti scarred the lower walls. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, crowned with razor wire that glinted in the streetlight. This wasn't a venue, this was a tomb. The Mercedes passed through a gate that opened at their approach, controlled by unseen hands. Minnie's security had clearly prepared the location in advance. As they pulled into the circular drive, Ariel saw more bodyguards positioned at strategic points, rooftop, entrance, perimeter. This wasn't just about privacy. This was a fortress. It's been closed for 3 years, Minnie said as the car stopped, since the night of the Seoul Philharmonic's American tour. Ariel's breath caught. She remembered that night. Everyone in the classical music world did. A fire during the final performance had killed 12 people, including the conductor. The investigation had called it arson, gang-related. The opera house had never reopened. Minnie exited without waiting for his bodyguard, and Ariel followed, violin case clutched against her chest like a shield. The night air smelled of salt water and decay. The front doors stood open, revealing darkness beyond. Minnie produced a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as they entered. Their footsteps echoed on marble floors covered in dust and debris. Ariel glimpsed water-stained walls, a fallen chandelier, velvet seats rotting in the abandoned lobby. But when they entered the main auditorium, she gasped. Someone had restored it. Not completely, the walls still bore scorch marks, the ceiling showed smoke damage, but the stage had been cleared and polished. A single chair sat in the center, upholstered in red velvet, beside it another chair simpler, and throughout the space hundreds of candles waited to be lit. This is where my sister died, Minnie said from behind her. Hana, she was first violin for the Seoul Philharmonic, 23 years old. Ariel turned to face him. In the flashlight's glow, his expression was stripped of its usual control. Raw grief carved lines around his mouth. The fire wasn't an accident, he continued. It was a message, from a rival family to mine. She was collateral damage in a war she didn't even know existed. I'm sorry, Ariel whispered, inadequate words for infinite loss. Minnie moved through the auditorium, lighting candles with practiced efficiency. As each flame caught, the space transformed. Light danced across damaged walls, creating beauty from ruin. I've tried to come here 17 times, he said. I can never stay. The silence is too loud. It screams with everything she'll never play again. He settled into the red velvet chair, and Ariel understood. This wasn't a date. This wasn't about her at all. This was an exorcism. What do you want me to play? She asked. Minnie's obsidian eyes met hers, and in them she saw her own ghosts reflected back. The song you only play when you think no one is listening. Ariel's fingers froze on the violin case clasps. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Minnie's voice was gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. You play it every Tuesday night at 2 a.m. in your apartment, when you think the world is asleep and no one will hear you fall apart. The blood drained from her face. You've been watching me. Listening, he stood, moving closer with that predatory grace. My penthouse is 4 blocks from your building. Sound carries at night when the city quiets down. I have insomnia. You have ghosts. For 6 months now, every Tuesday I hear you play something that sounds like grief-given melody. Ariel stepped back, but there was nowhere to go except deeper into the candlelit auditorium. That's stalking. Yes, he didn't deny it, didn't apologize. But the first time I heard it, I realized 2 things. 1, whoever taught you that song knew the same kind of pain I do, and 2, you were there. Where? But her voice cracked because she already knew. Ristorante Lucia, March 15th, 6 years ago. Minnie's jaw tightened. My family's accountant liked Italian food. He was meeting with representatives from a Colombian cartel negotiating territory rights. Standard business dinner, except someone decided to send a message. Ariel's violin case slipped from her numb fingers. The case hit the floor with a discordant clang. 8 people died that night, Minyi continued, his voice hollow. The accountant, 4 cartel members and 3 civilians who were just there for the pasta. He paused. Your parents and my sister. The world tilted. Ariel reached for the nearest seat to steady herself. Hana wasn't supposed to be there, Minyi said. She'd just arrived in Seattle for the tour, wanted authentic Italian before weeks of hotel food. She was sitting 3 tables away from you, playing Vivaldi on her phone while she waited for her order. I remember the music, Ariel whispered. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how perfectly it fit the moment. Then the windows exploded. Minyi moved closer, and now she could see the tattoos more clearly in the candlelight. Not just dragons and phoenixes. Between them, hidden in the negative space, were musical notes, bars of a composition inked into his skin. After she died, I found her journal, he said. She'd been composing something new, a requiem for the parts of ourselves we have to bury to survive. She never finished it. But 6 months ago, when I heard you playing at 2 a.m., I recognized the melody. Somehow, impossibly, you were playing my dead sister's unfinished song. Ariel's legs gave out. She sank into the seat, mind reeling. That's impossible. I've never seen sheet music for it. It just came to me one night, after the nightmares. I know, Minyi knelt before her, obsidian eyes searching hers. That's why I paid $50 million. I needed to know if I was losing my mind, or if somehow in that restaurant in those final moments, my sister's music found you. Ariel's hands trembled as she retrieved her violin from the fallen case. The instrument felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the knowledge that she'd been playing a dead woman's requiem without knowing its origin. Show me, she whispered, show me the journal. Minyi reached inside his jacket and produced a leather-bound book, worn at the edges. He opened it carefully, reverently, to a page covered in musical notation. The handwriting was delicate, precise, with Korean annotations in the margins. Ariel stared at the notes. They were identical to the melody that haunted her Tuesday nights. The melody she'd convinced herself was born from her own grief, her own fractured mind trying to process the unprocessable. I don't understand, she breathed. How is this possible? My family believes in Han, Minyi said quietly. The Korean concept of collective grief, of sorrow that transcends individual experience. Pain so deep it becomes ancestral, passed down through generations. He paused. Maybe it can also pass between strangers who share the same trauma. Ariel looked up at him, this dangerous man kneeling before her like a penitent. You think your sister's music somehow transferred to me, in those seconds before? Before the bullets stopped and the screaming started, Minyi's voice was rough. Yes, I think in that moment when both our worlds ended, something passed between the living and the dying. A gift, a curse, a haunting. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across the burned walls. Ariel positioned the violin under her chin, bow hovering above the strings. Her heart hammered against her ribs. I've never played it for anyone, she admitted. It always felt too private, too raw. Then we're both about to break, Minyi said, because I've never let anyone see me cry. Ariel drew the bow across the strings. The first note emerged soft, tentative, like a question asked in darkness. Then the second, building. The melody unfurled into the ruined opera house, filling the space with something that was both beautiful and unbearably sad. It spoke of loss and longing, of things severed too soon, of silence where music should have been. She watched Minyi as she played, watched the precise control of his expression begin to crack, his jaw clenched, his hands fisted against his thighs, and then, finally, a single tear escaped, tracking down his cheek and catching the candlelight. The most feared man on the West Coast was weeping. Ariel felt her own tears fall as she played, the bow moving across strings with increasing intensity. The melody climbed, desperate and defiant, refusing to accept the finality of death. It raged against the silence, against the empty chairs where loved ones should have sat. She played every Tuesday night at 2 a.m., played every nightmare, every moment of survivor's guilt, every time she'd wished the bullets had taken her instead. And somehow, impossibly, she was also playing for Hana, for a woman she'd never met but whose final composition lived in her fingers. When the last note faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding. Minyi's phone shattered the sacred silence, its harsh ring echoing through the opera house like a violation. He stood abruptly, wiping his face with precise movements, the vulnerability vanishing behind his usual mask of control. But Ariel had seen beneath it now. She knew what lived in the spaces between his careful composure. He answered in Korean, his voice clipped and cold. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but Ariel watched his expression harden with each word. When he ended the call, his jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." "What's wrong?" "Everything." Minyi moved toward her, and his bodyguards materialized from the shadows where they'd been stationed. "My council knows about tonight, about you, about the money I spent." Ariel lowered her violin. So in my world everything means something." He began extinguishing candles with swift efficiency. $50 million signals intention, investment. It signals that Kang Minyi cares about something beyond the syndicate, and caring is weakness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Ariel's fingers tightened around her violin's neck. "There are rules," Minyi continued, his voice taking on that silk-covered steel quality. "Sacred traditions that have governed Korean organized crime for generations. The head of a family doesn't show favoritism to outsiders. He doesn't spend frivolously on personal indulgences. He certainly doesn't cry in an opera house over a black woman playing his dead sister's music." "I'm not just," Ariel started, but he cut her off. "To them, that's exactly what you are, an outsider, a distraction, a threat to the purity of the family structure." Minyi's obsidian eyes found hers in the dimming light. "They're calling an emergency council meeting, tomorrow night, to discuss whether I'm still fit to lead." "Because you paid me to play violin." "Because I showed them I'm human." He moved closer, and Ariel could see the war happening behind his controlled expression. "In 6 years as head of the Kang Syndicate, I've never made a decision based on emotion. I've been perfect, ruthless, untouchable. Tonight I proved I'm none of those things." One of the bodyguards spoke urgently in Korean. Minyi replied sharply, then returned his attention to Ariel. "My cousin Yi-sung will use this. He's been waiting for any sign of weakness, any excuse to challenge my leadership. And the old guard on the council agrees with him. They believe the family has become too Americanized under my rule. They want a return to traditional values, which means no outsiders. Ever." Ariel's blood ran cold. "What does that mean for me?" Minyi's expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something that looked like fear. "It means that by sitting next to me tonight, by playing that song, by making me feel something I thought I'd buried with Hana," he paused, jaw working, "you've become a problem, and my family solves problems permanently." The estate materialized from the darkness like something out of a nightmare, dressed as a dream. Towering gates opened onto manicured grounds, and at the center sat a modern mansion of glass and stone that probably cost more than Ariel would earn in 10 lifetimes. Floodlights illuminated gardens with mathematical precision. Guards patrolled the perimeter with military synchronization. "This is where you live?" Ariel asked as the Mercedes climbed the circular drive. "This is where I survive," Minyi corrected. "There's a difference." He'd barely spoken during the drive from the opera house, his attention fixed on the tablet in his hands as he read what Ariel assumed were reports about the council's concerns. Damage assessment, threat analysis. She'd watched his fingers move across the screen with lethal efficiency, already strategizing how to counter whatever was coming. Now, as they exited the car, he finally looked at her. "You'll stay here tonight, my guest suite, full security detail outside your door." "I'm not staying." It wasn't a request. Minyi's voice carried that unmistakable edge of command. "If Yi-sung decides you're a vulnerability worth exploiting, your apartment is the first place he'll look. Here, you're under my protection. The council may question my judgment, but they won't violate the sanctity of my home. Not yet." Ariel clutched her violin case tighter. "So I'm a prisoner." "You're a guest in a gilded cage." Something almost like regret crossed his features. "I'm sorry, I never meant for this to touch you, I just needed—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I needed to know if I was haunted or insane. Turns out I'm both." A woman appeared at the entrance, elderly, elegant, with steel-grey hair pulled into a tight bun. She bowed to Minyi, spoke in rapid Korean, then assessed Ariel with sharp, calculating eyes that missed nothing. This is Grandmother Shin, Minyi said. She manages the household. She'll show you to your room and provide anything you need. Does she know why I'm here? Everyone knows why you're here by now. Minyi's expression darkened. The question is what they'll do about it. Grandmother Shin gestured for Ariel to follow, but Minyi caught her arm gently. The touch was brief, proper, yet Ariel felt its weight. The council meets at sunset tomorrow, he said quietly. Until then, don't leave the estate, don't trust anyone except Grandmother Shin, and if something happens to me— He pulled a business card from his pocket, pressing it into her palm. Call this number, he'll get you somewhere safe. Nothing's going to happen to you. Minyi's smile was sad and knowing. In my world, Miss Thompson, survival is never guaranteed, not even for kings. He released her arm and turned away, disappearing into the mansion's depths with his bodyguards flanking him like shadows. Ariel watched him go, the business card burning in her hand like a promise of the violence to come. Grandmother Shin touched her elbow, gentle but insistent, and led her toward a different wing entirely. Toward the gilded cage, where she'd wait to see if playing a dead woman's requiem would cost her everything. Ariel woke to the sound of shattering glass. For a disorienting moment, she was back in Ristorante Lucia, watching windows explode inward in slow motion. Then her training kicked in, the survival instincts she'd honed over 6 years of nightmares. She rolled from the bed, grabbing her violin case as she dropped low. Mori glass shouting in Korean, then gunfire sharp and unmistakable. The door to her suite burst open. Grandmother Shin stood there in a silk robe, a pistol in her weathered hands that looked obscenely competent. She barked something in Korean, then switched to English when Ariel stared. Basement now, stay low. What's happening? Yi-sung didn't wait for the council. The old woman's face was granite. He's making his own decision. They moved through corridors transformed into war zones. Ariel glimpsed bodyguards taking positions, returning fire toward the grounds where muzzle flashes lit the darkness. Smoke alarms screamed. Emergency lights painted everything in hellish red. Grandmother Shin guided her down a service stairwell, moving with surprising speed. But halfway down, footsteps echoed from below. The old woman froze, raised her pistol, then cursed in Korean. Back, go back. They reversed course, emerging into a different hallway. Through windows, Ariel saw the gardens crawling with armed men. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. This was an invasion. Where's Minyi? Ariel gasped. Fighting. Grandmother Shin's expression was fierce with pride and terror, like his father taught him, like death itself. They rounded a corner and found Minyi. He stood in the center of what had been an elegant sitting room, now destroyed. His white shirt was torn, splattered with blood, whether his or someone else's Ariel couldn't tell. 3 bodies lay motionless on the floor. He held a gun in one hand, and in his eyes burned something primal and terrifying. This wasn't the composed man from the opera house. This was the monster the underworld feared. I told you to secure her, he snapped at Grandmother Shin. The roots are compromised. Minyi's jaw tightened. His gaze found Ariel and something flickered in those obsidian depths. Calculation, decision, regret. They're here for her, he said flatly. Yi-sung's message is clear, remove the weakness or remove the leader. Mori gunfire erupted, closer now. Minyi moved to the window, assessing. When he turned back, his expression had shifted into something Ariel had never seen before. Resolve, absolute and final. There's a panic room in my study, reinforced steel, they'd need explosives to breach it. He looked at Grandmother Shin. Take her, don't open it for anyone except me. And you, the old woman demanded. Minyi checked his gun's magazine with practiced efficiency. I'm going to show my dear cousin why you don't threaten what's mine. The possessiveness in his voice made Ariel's breath catch. Move, he commanded. And as Grandmother Shin pulled her away, Ariel looked back to see Kang Minyi walk into the gunfire like a man who'd finally found something worth dying for. The panic room was exactly what Minyi had promised, a steel coffin lined with monitors showing security feeds from throughout the estate. Ariel watched the screens with mounting horror as Minyi moved through his home like an avenging angel, precise and lethal. Every movement was controlled violence. Every shot found its target. Grandmother Shin sat beside her, pistol resting on her lap, monitoring the feeds with professional detachment. But Ariel saw the way the old woman's fingers tightened each time Minyi appeared on screen. He fights like his father, Grandmother Shin said quietly, but his father never had a reason beyond power. Minyi, she paused. Tonight he has something different in his eyes. What? Ariel whispered. Purpose. The battle raged for 27 minutes. Ariel counted everyone. Then, abruptly, the gunfire stopped. The estate fell into an eerie silence broken only by distant sirens. One of the monitors showed the front courtyard. Minyi stood over a kneeling figure, Yi Sung she assumed based on the family resemblance. Blood streaked Minyi's face. His shirt was shredded, but he was alive. The audio crackled to life, Minyi's voice cold and absolute. Tell the council I'm calling an emergency session, not tomorrow. Now, tell them Kang Minyi has an announcement that cannot wait. 3 hours later, Ariel sat in Minyi's study while he addressed the council via video conference. She'd insisted on being present, and he hadn't argued. Grandmother Shin had cleaned and bandaged his wounds, changed his shirt, but nothing could hide the exhaustion carved into his features. On the screen, 12 faces stared back, the council of elders who governed the Kang syndicate. Their expressions ranged from disapproval to barely concealed rage. Minyi stood before them like a king before his court, and Ariel realized with sudden clarity that this was exactly what he was, and exactly what he was about to surrender. Honored council, he began in English, his voice steady. For 6 years I have led this family with absolute loyalty. I have expanded our territory, eliminated our enemies, and brought prosperity that my father never achieved. I have given you everything. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces on screen. Tonight I ask for something in return, my freedom. The room erupted in angry Korean. Minyi waited for silence, then continued. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as head of the Kang family. My cousin Yiwon will assume leadership, not Yi Sung, Ariel noted. With full council support, I will transfer all assets, all territories, all connections. In exchange, I want one thing. What could possibly be worth an empire? An elderly council member demanded. Minyi turned, his obsidian eyes finding Ariel. When he looked back at the screen, his expression was stripped of pretense. Peace, he said simply, and the right to protect the woman who gave it to me. The silence that followed was absolute. Ariel stood, her legs trembling. Minyi, you can't. I already have. He looked at her with something that might have been love or might have been liberation. Empires are easy to build. Finding someone who understands your ghosts, that's worth everything. 6 months later, Ariel stood on the porch of a cabin overlooking the Oregon coast, watching the Pacific Ocean wage its eternal war against the cliffs. The morning air smelled of salt and pine, clean and uncomplicated. Behind her, she heard Minyi moving through the kitchen, the domestic sounds of coffee brewing and breakfast being prepared. It still felt surreal sometimes. The man who'd once commanded an empire now spent his mornings making French toast and arguing with her about whether Brahms or Beethoven had written the superior violin concerto. The transition hadn't been seamless. The first month, Minyi would wake at 3 a.m., reaching for weapons that were no longer there, scanning for threats in the darkness. His body remembered violence even when his mind tried to forget. Ariel would find him on this same porch, staring at the ocean like a man still uncertain he deserved peace. But slowly, incrementally, he'd begun to soften. The rigid control loosened. The constant vigilance eased. Last week she'd actually heard him laugh, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine, when she'd accidentally spilled an entire jar of rosin on herself. Coffee's ready, he called from inside. Ariel turned, taking in the sight of him framed in the doorway. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, his tattoos visible where he'd rolled up his sleeves. The dragons and phoenixes remained, but they looked different somehow in this context. Less like marks of power, more like reminders of who he'd been. Who they'd both been. I have something for you, Minyi said as she entered. He handed her not coffee but a leather-bound journal, Hana's journal. You're giving me this. Finishing it, actually. He guided her to the table where sheet music lay spread out. I've been working on it, the requiem she started. I'm not a composer, but I thought with your help we could complete what she began. Ariel's eyes burned with tears. She looked at the notation, recognizing the melody that had haunted them both, now expanded and developed into something fuller. Something that acknowledged the pain but didn't stop there. that moved beyond grief into something that resembled hope. There's a community center in town, Minyi continued quietly. They need music teachers. I thought maybe we could volunteer. You could teach violin. I could. He paused, almost shy. I could try to be useful without violence. You've always been more than violence, Ariel said, touching his face. You just needed someone to show you. That evening they performed the completed requiem together. Minyi on piano, he'd been taking lessons, practicing with the same intensity he'd once applied to building empires, and Ariel on violin. They played for an audience of two, Grandmother Shin, who'd chosen to follow Minyi into exile, and the ghosts who'd brought them together. The melody soared through the cabin, finally complete. It spoke of loss and love, of the price of peace, of trading crowns for contentment. When the final note faded, Minyi took Ariel's hand. Thank you, he whispered, for the $50 million silence that saved my life. Ariel smiled. Best investment you ever made. Outside, the ocean kept its rhythm, and for the first time in 6 years, neither of them was haunted anymore.